In this PowerPoint, we will take an introductory look at the way psychoactive substances and addiction impact the brain and body. This is where we start to understand what happens in the science of addiction, and we are going to start first with the larger systems and then work our way to the smaller aspects. When discussing the science of addiction, it is important to look at the concept of homeostasis, which is defined as the body's desire to maintain balance at all times and maintain a status of equilibrium. As humans, we need to maintain balance within our body in many aspects, such as temperature, water content, and both sodium and glucose concentrations. These are just some examples of where homeostasis is needed. With psychoactive substances and addiction issues, this can have a significant impact on homeostasis. In fact, we see that psychoactive drugs impact homeostasis in a variety of ways. In particular, there are impacts on all three of the nervous systems, the somatic, autonomic, and central nervous systems. Breaking these down individually, the somatic system is the part of our body that interacts with the environment and makes adjustment to maintain homeostasis. This is the system that manages the voluntary control of body movements such as voluntary reflexes. The autonomic complements the somatic by functioning more below the level of consciousness in involuntary reactions. It encompasses our heart rate, digestion, and respiration. This system is generally divided into two main branches: the sympathetic, which is responsible for increasing our heart rate and blood pressure as needed, and this is the branch that creates what we refer to as a fight, flight, or freeze response when faced with a dangerous situation. In these types of circumstances, we may react by fighting what is the perceived threat, trying to run away, or freezing, meaning unable to make a decision or know how to react and move. The parasympathetic is what we refer to as the rest and digest system, and will do the opposite by slowing our heart rate as needed. Moving to the central nervous system, this includes the brain and spinal cord, and it is the area responsible for a range of activities including cognition, memory, mood, and coordination. Taking a closer look specifically at the brain, it is important to look at what types of addiction impact it. In reality, all types of addiction impact the way in one way or another. So this will include both substance use issues as well as behavioral addictions such as gambling. Currently, behavioral addictions are receiving more attention, and it is important to note that many of the key issues that surface with psychoactive substances and substance use disorder are also present with behavioral addictions. Looking more closely at the brain, three key structures impacted by psychoactive substances and addiction are the cerebral cortex, the limbic system, and the brainstem. The cerebral cortex is often considered a powerhouse responsible for maintaining cognitive functioning. It is divided into four main lobes, and we will take a brief look at the main function in each lobe. First is the parietal lobe, which is where sensory input for things like taste, temperature, and touch is located. In addition, this area is responsible for our visual spatial processing, which allows us to navigate our environment and avoid tripping on an obstacle that might be placed in our path as we walk. Then the frontal lobe, which is involved with impulse control, planning, and decision making. Then the temporal lobe, which focuses on auditory perceptions and language. And lastly, the occipital lobe, which is most known as the visual processing center. So with psychoactive substances, we often look at how substances can quote-unquote hijack the brain, meaning the processing that takes place in each lobe is compromised. Some examples are the parietal lobe, which can be compromised through substances by causing a slower reaction time or inability to avoid bumping into things or tripping and falling while walking. With the frontal lobe, substances can interfere with solid decision making by not taking into account potential consequences. It can also lead to a lack of inhibitions and no self-restraint. Substances impacting the temporal lobe can result in slurred speech, while the occipital lobe can result in blurred vision. The impact of psychoactive substances on the cerebral cortex can be an important concern to recognize. However, when that is paired with the impact substances and addiction can have on the limbic system, these concerning effects increase. Have you ever been at a crosswalk where the lights weren't working properly? Where you might see the stop and go lights blinking erratically? Well, this is what occurs within both the cerebral cortex and the limbic system when under the influence of addiction. The brain is experiencing a type of breaking down of what is referred to as the stop and go system. How this happens is with the overload on the limbic system. If the cerebral cortex is considered the area for cognitive functioning, the limbic system is most known for being the quote-unquote emotional brain, or being our old brain, where our feelings of pleasure related to doing certain activities, our motivation, and formation of emotional memories are stored. It is associated with creating a relationship between our feelings and motivation. It is involved with managing our feelings, as well as fostering a type of emotional control. So substance and addiction disrupt this area and change how it functions. With addiction, the limbic system is more apt to cause strong feelings in the desire for short-term pleasures and more instant relief, driving a person to focus on keep doing something that will feel good in that moment. So in essence, psychoactive substances and addictive behaviors push the limbic system into override, and the stop system of our cerebral cortex loses its ability to intervene. The last area to explore is the brainstem. This is considered to be a small but mighty area as it controls all aspects of functioning related to being alive. For example, things like breathing and blood circulation. The brainstem plays a critical role as it is responsible for sharing information between the brain and body. An example of how the brainstem can be impacted with substances is with the gag reflex, and if someone is vomiting due to ingesting too much of a substance. If the brainstem is compromised, the gag reflex will not be triggered and someone can choke on their own vomit. Now we'll be moving to the more smaller areas, in particular what are called neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters play a vital role in being our chemical messengers in maintaining homeostasis in things like mood and sleep. Neurotransmitters are stored within the neurons and are released from one neuron to another to maintain these types of homeostasis. This communication between neurons is referred to as neurotransmission. Looking specifically at addiction issues, there are several neurotransmitters that can be impacted. As an introduction to this area, we are going to look at three key ones. These are dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine, and they're considered to be the trifecta of neurotransmitters with addiction. These three have the capacity to overlap and interact in ways that significantly impact areas of mood and cognitive functioning. So a commonality with all these three is that they affect both of these. So let's take a closer look at each of these three neurotransmitters. Starting first with dopamine, it is considered to be the neurotransmitter that is affected by all psychoactive substances, as well as a key component in behavioral or process addictions such as gambling. One reason for this is that dopamine is a component of the reward properties, or what is called the brain's reward pathway. This pathway actually involves several areas of the brain, including many discussed earlier, and is how dopamine is released throughout the brain. This pathway is very powerful, and when dopamine is activated and released throughout this pathway, it results in strong feelings of pleasure. Addiction activates this system, and there is a desire to keep repeating the actions that bring a sense of pleasure throughout the release of dopamine. Next is serotonin, which is connected to additional areas such as impulse and memory. The last of the three is norepinephrine, which is involved with alertness and concentration. More specifically, it is a major contributor to the fight, or freeze response, as it generates paying attention to our environment. It can be an asset because it helps to keep us alert and able to act in what may be perceived as a dangerous situation. When looking at the impact addiction can have on neurotransmitters themselves, the general impact occurs both in the intoxication and withdrawal process. What we see here are the effects that occur on neurotransmitters during the intoxication process are generally described as the opposite of what occurs in the withdrawal process. So, for example, if the intoxication process causes a release of a certain neurotransmitter, the withdrawal process will result in the opposite effect. When discussing withdrawal and the impact on neurotransmitters, we need to keep in mind both acute withdrawal, again, acute meaning in the present, and what is called post-acute withdrawal syndrome, or PAWS for short. PAWS is about the brain's efforts to return to homeostasis and heal during the recovery process. The healing process during this time is often viewed as at least a 3 to 6 month time frame, and not uncommon to need 9 months to 2 years to achieve optimal functioning return levels and a return to homeostasis. Lastly, we want to understand the specific way psychoactive substances can impact the neurotransmission process. While there are many possible ways, there are 3 main ways. The first is to mimic or increase neurotransmitter activity, which is described as being an agonist. The second way is to block or reduce neurotransmitter activity, which is being an antagonist. And the final way is what we refer to as a reuptake inhibitor. During the neurotransmission process, some residual transmitters can be left in the synapse, or the space between one neuron trying to communicate and sending a neurotransmitter to the other neuron. These neurotransmitters left in the synapse, or space between the two neurons, will try to make their way back to the original neuron to be reabsorbed. However, with a reuptake inhibitor, this reabsorption is initially blocked, leaving an excess of neurotransmitters to remain in the synapse.